Imagine yourself as a soldier in George Washington's army. Hundreds of your comrades have lost their lives, and you too are struggling with hunger in the cold. Your pay hasn't come for months. You cannot even get word from your family. Then, one night, you suddenly make a decision. Because you no longer want to endure everything that is happening, you quietly walk past the sentries and slip away outside. As you know, this act is called desertion, and throughout the American Revolution, a great many people deserted. Most who hear about this for the first time find many questions coming to mind. What really happened to them? What happened when the army caught a man who ran? Before we learn the answers, if you find the hidden and difficult side of history worth understanding, take a second to subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let us see what happened to a man from the moment he decided to desert. Picture a soldier in Washington's army on a bitter winter night. The fires have burned low. His hut is freezing. His stomach is empty, and he has not been paid in months. He lies awake listening to the wind, and somewhere in those long, dark hours, he makes a decision that could cost him his life. He gathers what little he has, slips past the sentries and walks out into the darkness, away from the army, toward home. That single act had a name, and it was one of the gravest words in the military world of the day. Desertion. To leave the army without permission, to abandon your post and your comrades, was not treated as simply quitting a job. It was treated as a crime against the whole cause, punishable in the harshest terms the age could devise. And it was astonishingly common. Across the Revolutionary War, tens of thousands of men deserted the Continental Army at one point or another. In the worst winters, they slipped away by the hundreds, night after night. So, the real question of this account is simple and grim. What actually happened to a man who did this? What happened when he walked into the dark? And what happened if the army caught him again? The answer runs from the merciful to the terrible, and it reveals a great deal about the desperate world these soldiers lived in, and about the man who commanded them. Before we follow the deserter to his fate, we have to understand something that the word desertion hides. Most of these men were not cowards, and most of them were not traitors. They were, more often than not, simply at the end of their endurance. Consider what they were actually living through. At the winter camp of Valley Forge, soldiers went days with no bread at all. They had no shoes and left bloody footprints in the snow. Disease swept through the crowded huts, and by some estimates, around 2,000 men died that single winter, not in battle, but from hunger, cold, and sickness. On top of that, many had not been paid in months, and the paper money they were promised was losing its value by the day. And there was one more pressure the modern mind forgets. Many men had signed up for a fixed term, often a single year. And when that term expired, they believed they had every right to go home to farms and families that were falling apart without them. So, when a soldier slipped away, it was rarely a simple act of betrayal. Sometimes it was a starving man going to find food. Sometimes it was a farmer desperate to save his family's harvest. Sometimes it was a man who felt his time was up, and the army was refusing to let him leave. None of that made desertion legal, and none of it made it safe. But it means that the men who faced the whip and the firing squad were, very often, not villains. They were desperate people who had reached a breaking point. That is what makes their fate so hard to look at. Walking out of camp was the easy part. Staying gone was far harder, and This is where the deserters' troubles usually began. A man on the run in the 1770s was in a dangerous position. He could not simply blend into a crowd. If he headed home, that was the first place the army would look, because officers knew exactly where a homesick soldier was likely to go. If he tried to reach the British and surrender, he risked being taken for a spy. And everywhere he went, he needed food, shelter, and safe roads, none of which were guaranteed to a lone man in ragged clothes with no pass and no money. The army made the hunt easier for itself in a very deliberate way. Deserters were advertised. Officers published descriptions of the missing men, their names, their appearance, the clothes they wore, and offered rewards for their capture. A reward could tempt a farmer, an innkeeper, or a neighbor to turn a fugitive in. So, the deserter moved through a landscape full of eyes, any one of which might be calculating the price on his head. Many made it home and were never caught. But many others were run down within days, betrayed by the very communities they were trying to reach. And once a patrol laid hands on him, the deserter's brief taste of freedom was over, and the machinery of military justice began to turn. The army did not simply shrug off the men who left. It hunted them because every deserter was both a lost soldier and a dangerous example to the others. Patrols were sent out after known deserters. Cavalry could cover ground quickly, and a man on foot, tired and hungry, was no match for mounted pursuers who knew the roads. Local militia and civilians were drawn into the effort by those rewards, turning whole regions into a net. Sometimes deserters were caught alone, sometimes in small groups, since men often ran together for safety and were taken together as a result. There are accounts of parties of deserters being brought back into camp under guard, roped or bound, to face what waited for them. For the captured man, the return to camp must have been its own kind of torture. He was marched back to the very place he had risked everything to escape, past the eyes of the comrades he had left, to be held until his trial. And he knew, as everyone in that camp knew, that the army did not go to the trouble of dragging deserters back in order to forgive them quietly. It brought them back to be judged, and very often to be made an example of in front of the entire assembled army. The purpose of his punishment was not only to deal with him, it was to be witnessed. When a captured deserter faced justice, it was not a lawless free-for-all. It followed a formal military code, though a code that offered him very little room to escape. From the earliest days of the war, the Continental Army was governed by a set of rules called the Articles of War, first adopted in 1775. These laid out the crimes a soldier could commit and the punishments that followed. Desertion sat near the top of that grim list. In fact, 16 different offenses could carry the death penalty, and desertion was one of them, alongside mutiny, sedition, and abandoning a post to the enemy. A captured deserter would be tried by a court-martial, a panel of officers who would hear the case and decide his sentence. The outcomes varied enormously, and that variation is important. A first offense, or a man with a good record and sympathetic circumstances, might receive a lighter sentence. A repeat deserter or one caught trying to reach the enemy could expect the worst. The court could sentence a man to a brutal flogging, to more elaborate physical punishments, or to death. And hanging over the entire process was the commander-in-chief himself, George Washington, who reviewed court-martial proceedings closely, and who could soften a sentence, or just as easily, demand a harsher one. Whether a deserter lived or died often came down to the details of his case, the mood of the moment, and the judgment of that one man at the top. For a great many deserters and other offenders, the sentence was flogging. And to understand what happened to these men, you have to understand just how savage this punishment truly was. Flogging was carried out in public before the assembled troops, so that every soldier would see and remember. The man was stripped to the waist and tied to a post or a set of crossed halberds, and then whipped across the bare back, often with a whip of knotted cords known as a cat of 9 tails, a single handle splitting into 9 lashing strands. Early in the war, the maximum sentence was set at 39 lashes. It was soon raised to 100. Washington himself thought even that was too lenient, and repeatedly asked for the limit to be raised to 500, though on occasion sentences did climb far beyond the official cap. Think about what 100 lashes actually meant. The knotted cords tore the skin from a man's back until it was a mass of raw wounds. To spread out the suffering and to keep from killing the man outright, large sentences were sometimes divided, so many lashes now and more later, once the back had partly healed, only for the wounds to be opened all over again. An army surgeon often stood by with the authority to stop the punishment if he believed the prisoner would die. A flogged man might carry the scars and the memory for the rest of his life. And yet, brutal as it was, the lash was often the merciful option, because for the worst cases, the army had punishments that did not end with a scarred back. Flogging was the most common serious punishment, but it was far from the only one. The military world of the 18th century had inherited a whole grim toolbox of ways to inflict pain and humiliation, and Washington's army used its share of them. Some punishments were designed above all to humiliate. A deserter might be forced to ride the wooden horse, made to sit astride a sharp railing for hours, sometimes with weights tied to his feet to increase the pain. Others were paraded through camp seated backward on a horse, facing the tail, an image of total disgrace meant to shame both the man and anyone tempted to follow him. Men were chained to a heavy log or clog of wood and made to drag it around for days. Some were forced to wear their coats turned inside out, marking them as offenders for all to see. Then there was running the gauntlet, a punishment that turned a man's own comrades into his tormentors. The soldiers of his unit would form 2 long lines facing each other, each man holding a switch or a rod, and the condemned man would be forced to walk or stumble down the middle while every soldier struck him as he passed. It was a way of spreading the punishment across the whole company and binding them to it. Some deserters were branded, marked in the flesh with a hot iron so that they would carry the proof of their crime forever. These were the punishments for the men who were allowed to live. For others, the sentence was final. For the gravest cases, repeat deserters, ringleaders, men who tried to carry others over to the enemy, the sentence was death. And the army made sure that death was seen. Execution usually came in one of 2 forms. A condemned man might be hanged, which was the most common method, or he might be shot by a firing squad drawn from his fellow soldiers. Like every other punishment, it was carried out in front of the assembled army, on a chosen ground, with the troops marched out to witness it. The whole point was the audience. Washington and his officers believed that the sight of a deserter meeting his end was one of the few things powerful enough to hold a starving, unpaid army together. A single death, witnessed by thousands, was meant to be worth more than any speech. We have a vivid record of one such scene from a soldier who was there. He described condemned men being marched to the place of execution, crying and pleading and praying aloud, while women wept and one man's wife screamed, almost out of her mind with grief. Graves were dug in advance, in plain sight of the condemned. For a man kneeling on the cold ground, blindfolded, listening to the soldiers loading their muskets a few feet away, those final moments must have stretched into eternity. And yet, in some of these scenes, at the very last instant, something extraordinary happened. Not every man who knelt before a firing squad actually died. This is perhaps the most haunting part of the whole account, and it reveals the strange logic at the heart of military punishment. Sometimes the army had no intention of killing the man at all. The point was to make him and everyone watching believe that it would. Consider a scene from the spring of 1780. 11 deserters from the Connecticut line had been sentenced to death. They were marched out to be executed, and the grim ceremony began. But at the last moment, 10 of the 11 were reprieved. According to an eyewitness, men who were already kneeling with bandages over their eyes, had the blindfolds removed, were untied, and were sent back to their companies alive. Only one of the 11 was actually put to death, chosen to serve as the example, while the others were spared after living through their own execution in their minds. Earlier in the war, in 1776, a soldier named Ebenezer Leffingwell had been sentenced to die for leaving his post and was brought to the place of execution, only to be pardoned at the last possible moment through the intercession of an officer who spoke for him. This was not mercy for its own sake alone. It was a calculated act. Washington understood that a pardon delivered at the edge of the grave could be as powerful as an execution, filling the ranks with both relief and dread. But he made the stakes clear. After sparing one man, he announced coldly that the next offender would suffer death without mercy. And that was no hollow threat. The reprieve and the bullet were two sides of the same terrible coin, and a kneeling man never knew until the final second which one he would receive. Behind every one of these sentences stood George Washington, and his position was an agonizing one. He was caught between two forces that pulled him in opposite directions, and the fate of the deserter hung in the space between them. On one side stood the need for discipline. Washington believed and often said that discipline was the soul of an army. He knew that if men could simply walk away whenever they were hungry or afraid, with no consequence, there would soon be no army at all. From that view, harsh punishment was not cruelty. It was survival. A few men broken or shot might be the price of keeping thousands in the ranks long enough to win the war. And so he pushed for harsher penalties, reviewed sentences to make sure they were severe enough, and let executions proceed. But on the other side stood a truth he could never escape. He was desperate for men. Every soldier he executed or crippled was a soldier he could not afford to lose from an army that was always too small. And Washington understood something deeper still. Punish too harshly, and you might not frighten the men into obedience. You might drive them into open mutiny instead. So he balanced constantly between severity and mercy. He allowed floggings and executions, but he also issued pardons, sometimes sweeping ones, and he came to understand that the only real cure for desertion was not the whip at all. It was feeding, clothing, and paying his men, and giving them a reason to stay. The deserter's fate in the end was decided by a commander trying to hold an impossible line between terror and compassion. As you saw a moment ago, what happened to a soldier who deserted did not come down to a single thing. It depended entirely on the situation. In other words, it depended on why he ran, on whether he was caught, on his record, on the mood of the court, on a great many reasons, in short. Among those who ran, some reached their homes and were never heard from again. Some were caught and had their backs whipped for hours, and were then sent back to the ranks as though nothing had happened. And a few knelt before the guns, and some of them lived while others lost their lives. If you had been a soldier back in that time, would you have done the same things, knowing the consequences? Or no matter how hard the conditions were, would you have kept staying inside the army?